In the winter of 1849, two sisters vanished from their Illinois farmstead without a trace. When searchers finally found evidence of their fate, the discovery defied every known law of nature. What they uncovered in that frozen ground would haunt the township for generations, and science still cannot explain it. The Wainwright farmstead sat like a lonely sentinel against the endless prairie, where the wind carved stories into the tall grass and winter came early to stay. Margaret, 23, and Eleanor, 19, had called this place home since their parents' death from consumption 2 years prior. The sisters were known throughout Calhoun County for their striking resemblance. Same auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, same piercing green eyes that seemed to see beyond the veil of the ordinary world. Margaret, the elder, possessed a practical mind that kept their small farm running despite the harsh realities of frontier life. She could birth a calf in a blizzard, preserve meat through the longest winter, and negotiate grain prices with the shrewdness of a seasoned merchant. Eleanor, however, was different. Neighbors whispered that she possessed what the old country folk called the sight, an ability to sense things before they happened, to know when death walked among them. The autumn of 1849 had been particularly brutal. Crops failed across the county, livestock died from a mysterious wasting disease, and an early frost killed what little remained of the harvest. Yet the Wainwright sisters seemed untouched by these misfortunes. Their corn stood tall when others withered, their cattle remained healthy while neighboring herds succumbed to illness. This strange prosperity did not go unnoticed. Reverend Joshua Blackwood, who presided over the small wooden church that served 3 townships, had begun including pointed sermons about unnatural blessings and bargains made in darkness. His congregation hung on every word, their eyes drifting toward the Wainwright pew, which had remained conspicuously empty since their parents' funeral. The sisters had stopped attending services, claiming they found their solace in nature rather than within wooden walls. As November's bitter cold settled over the prairie, strange reports began filtering into town. Travelers claimed to see lights dancing over the Wainwright property at midnight. Not the warm glow of hearth fires, but cold, blue flames that seemed to move with purpose. Others spoke of hearing voices carried on the wind, speaking in tongues that predated any known language. Samuel Morrison, who delivered supplies to isolated farms, made his final run to the Wainwright place on November 15th. He found the sisters in good health and high spirits, though he noted something unsettling in Eleanor's manner. She kept staring at the horizon as if expecting someone, her fingers tracing strange patterns in the frost on the window pane. 3 days later, both sisters vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would challenge everything the rational mind could accept. What happened next would prove that some disappearances defy explanation and that the prairie holds secrets darker than the longest winter night. November 18th, 1849, dawned with an unnatural stillness that even the most seasoned frontiersmen found disturbing. The usual symphony of prairie life, creaking timber, lowing cattle, the distant bark of farm dogs, had fallen silent around the Wainwright property. It was as if nature itself held its breath, waiting for some terrible revelation to unfold. Thomas Whitmore, whose farm bordered the Wainwright land to the east, was the first to notice the absence of smoke from their chimney. In November's bitter cold, no hearth would remain unlit past dawn unless something was terribly wrong. Thomas had been meaning to check on the sisters since the odd lights had been spotted 3 nights. Running, but farm work and his wife's warnings about meddling in ungodly affairs had kept him away. By mid-morning, his conscience would no longer be quieted. Bundling against the cutting wind, Thomas made his way across the frost-hardened fields to the Wainwright cabin. The silence grew more oppressive with each step. Even his own breathing seemed muffled, as though the very air had thickened into something that swallowed sound. The Wainwright cabin stood exactly as it always had, its log walls weathered but sturdy, the small vegetable garden now buried under November's first heavy snow. But something was fundamentally wrong with the scene before him. The windows, usually glowing warm with lamplight or activity, stared back like dead eyes. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. The henhouse, which should have been alive with the clucking and rustling of 24 birds, remained eerily quiet. Thomas called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Margaret! Eleanor! "Are you well?" The words seemed to die just feet from his lips, absorbed by something that felt almost hungry in its attention. He approached the heavy wooden door, noting that the latch string hung outside, the traditional sign that visitors were welcome. Inside, the cabin was arranged as if the sisters had simply stepped out for a moment. 2 bowls sat on the rough-hewn table containing what appeared to be the remnants of oatmeal, now frozen solid. A half-finished piece of needlework lay on Margaret's chair, the needle still threaded, as though she had intended to return momentarily. The hearth contained only cold ashes, suggesting the fire had been allowed to die sometime during the night. But it was what Thomas found in Eleanor's room that first suggested this was no ordinary absence. Her bed was made with military precision, but pressed into the quilt was the clear outline of a hum and form, as if someone had lain there with such weight that the impression remained permanently fixed in the fabric. The sisters were gone, but the questions they left behind were just beginning to multiply in the most disturbing ways imaginable. Word of the sisters' disappearance spread through Calhoun County like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, a dozen men had gathered at the Wainwright cabin, their faces grim with the knowledge that winter claimed lives quickly on the Illinois prairie. Sheriff Marcus Cole, a tall man whose weathered hands had seen every form of frontier violence, organized the search with military efficiency born from necessity. The men divided into teams, each taking a different compass direction from the cabin. They searched methodically. Barn, root cellar, the small smokehouse where cured meat hung like grisly ornaments. Every building, every possible hiding place was thoroughly examined. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, began to paint a picture that defied rational explanation. No footprints led away from the cabin, despite the fresh snow that had fallen 2 nights before their disappearance. The sisters' winter coats hung on wooden pegs by the door, their heavy boots arranged neatly beneath. In November's killing cold, no one ventured outside without proper protection, yet here was evidence that they had done exactly that, or had simply vanished from within their own home. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, the county's only physician and a man of scientific temperament, examined the cabin with the careful eye of someone seeking logical explanations. He noted that both beds appeared to have been slept in the night of the disappearance. The sheets were disturbed, pillows showed the impression of heads. Yet Eleanor's room contained that strange, permanent indentation in the quilt that seemed to suggest something far heavier than a 19-year-old girl had pressed into the fabric. More disturbing still were the cattle. The Wainwright herd, which had remained mysteriously healthy while neighboring livestock perished, was found huddled in the farthest corner of their pasture. The animals appeared terrified, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed almost human in its intensity. When the men attempted to approach, the cattle shied away with such violence that several injured themselves against the fence rails. As the search expanded beyond the immediate property, other unsettling details emerged. Jacob Henley, who lived a mile south, reported that his dogs had howled incessantly for 3 straight nights, beginning November 15th. The animals had refused to eat, had cowered in their shelter, and would not be coaxed outdoors even for their usual evening patrol of his property. Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, the Reverend's wife, admitted that she had seen strange lights above the Wainwright farm on the night of November 17th. Not the warm glow of windows or lanterns, but something else. Blue-white flames that seemed to dance in patterns too deliberate to be natural fire. As darkness approached on that first day of searching, the men had covered 20 square miles of prairie and found absolutely nothing. No trace, no clue, no indication of where 2 young women had gone. The mystery was deepening, and winter was only beginning. On the second day of searching, the men discovered something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Deputy William Hayes, following what he thought might be a game trail through a grove of oak trees half a mile from the cabin, stumbled upon a clearing that defied every natural law he understood. The clearing was perfectly circular, roughly 30 feet in diameter, and within its boundaries no snow had fallen. While the surrounding forest floor lay buried under 6 inches of fresh powder, this space remained bare, the earth dark and strangely warm to the touch. More unnerving still, every tree that bordered the clearing was dead. Not the gradual death of disease or aught, but something that appeared to have killed them instantly, leaving the bark blackened as if by some internal fire. Dr. Morrison knelt to examine the soil, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. The earth within the circle was not merely unfrozen, it was actively warm, steam rising from it in the November cold. When he pressed his hand to the ground, it felt almost feverish, as if something beneath the surface burned with an unnatural heat. Even more disturbing, the soil had a strange, oily quality that left dark stains on his gloves. Around the perimeter of the clearing, they found objects that belonged to the Wainwright sisters. Eleanor's silver hairbrush lay at the base of a dead oak, its bristles somehow embedded with what appeared to be ice crystals that refused to melt despite the proximity to the warm earth. Margaret's woolen shawl hung from a blackened branch, the fabric undamaged but completely drained of color, as if the very life had been drawn from the wool. But it was Deacon Philip Warren who made the discovery that sent grown men fleeing from that accursed place. Following the circular perimeter, he found footprints, not the expected impressions of the sisters' feet, but something else entirely. The prints were human in basic shape, but wrong in every detail, too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be claw marks where toes should have been. The prints circled the clearing 7 times, growing deeper with each circuit, until the final set was pressed so deeply into the frozen ground that they appeared to have been made by something of immense weight. Reverend Blackwood, who had joined the search despite his wife's protests, took one look at the scene and began reciting the Lord's Prayer in a voice that shook with more than cold. The other men found themselves joining in, their words creating small clouds of vapor that made to hang longer than natural in the still air. As they prepared to leave that unholy place, every man present swore, completely ash, not burned, but somehow drained of all substance until they crumbled at the slightest touch. Where yesterday there had been blackened bark and lifeless wood, now there remained only grey dust that swirled in patterns too deliberate to be caused by wind. Dr. Morrison, despite his scientific skepticism, could no longer deny that they faced something beyond natural explanation. He had spent the sleepless night researching every medical and botanical text in his possession, seeking some rational cause for soil that generated heat without fire, for vegetation that died instantly without disease. Every avenue of scientific inquiry led to the same impossible conclusion. What they had discovered defied the known laws of nature. The expansion of the cursed area brought with it new horrors. Fresh objects belonging to the Wainwright sisters appeared around the enlarged perimeter, as if the growing circle was somehow drawing their possessions from impossible distances. Eleanor's prayer book was found buried halfway in the heated earth, its pages fused together by some process that left the leather binding untouched. Margaret's thimble lay at the center of what had once been a mighty oak, the silver metal somehow twisted into shapes that hurt the eyes to contemplate. But it was the discovery of the sisters' clothing that truly terrified the search party. Both women's dresses were found scattered around the circle, not torn or damaged, but somehow emptied, as if the bodies that had once filled them had simply dissolved. The fabric retained the shape of human forms, pressed flat against the unnatural earth like discarded cocoons after some terrible metamorphosis. Thomas Whitmore, who had discovered the initial disappearance, made an observation that chilled every man present. The clothing lay arranged in a pattern that suggested the sisters had been walking in the same circular path as those inhuman footprints, 7 circuits around the heated ground, but the final pieces of their garments lay at the very center of the clearing, where the earth was hottest and most disturbed. As the search party retreated from that accursed place, every man understood that they were no longer looking for missing women. They were witnessing something that belonged more to nightmare than reality, and the expanding circle of blackened earth suggested that whatever had claimed the Wainwright sisters was far from finished with Calhoun County. The worst revelations were yet to come. Word of the expanding cursed ground reached every farmstead within 20 miles by evening, and what happened next revealed the true depths of fear that had taken root in the hearts of the prairie folk. Rather than fleeing from the supernatural threat, a group of the county's most God-fearing men organized themselves into what they called the Night Watchers, volunteers who would take shifts observing the clearing from a safe distance, documenting whatever unholy events might unfold under cover of darkness. Deputy Hayes led the first watch, accompanied by 3 farmers whose courage was bolstered by whiskey and desperation. They established their observation post in a grove of living trees roughly 200 yards from the cursed circle, close enough to witness events but far enough to retreat if necessary. What they observed during those dark hours would be recounted in hushed whispers for generations to come. The activity began at precisely midnight, as if responding to some cosmic summons. The heated earth began to glow with a faint blue-white luminescence that cast no shadows despite its intensity. The light pulsed in rhythm, like the breathing of some massive sleeping creature buried beneath the prairie soil. As the men watched in horrified fascination, shapes began to emerge from the glowing ground, not rising from beneath but materializing like smoke given form. Hayes later swore under oath that he witnessed the ghostly figures of Margaret and Eleanor Wainwright moving within that cursed circle, but these were not the wholesome farm girls that the community had known. These apparitions were somehow wrong, their movements too fluid, their forms shifting between human and something altogether more disturbing. They walked the same circular pattern that had been pressed into the earth, 7 circuits that grew more frantic with each repetition. Most terrifying of all was what the watchers heard. The sisters' voices, unmistakably their own, rose from the clearing in a language that seemed to predate human speech. The words were alien yet familiar, as if they awakened some ancestral memory buried deep in the listeners' minds. The chanting grew in intensity with each circuit, building to a crescendo that coincided with the expansion of the cursed ground. During the 4th hour of their vigil, the watchers observed something that broke Deputy Hayes's composure entirely. Other figures joined the ghostly sisters, tall, unnaturally thin shapes that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight. These entities moved with purpose, arranging objects around the perimeter of the circle in patterns that hurt to look upon directly. When dawn finally broke, the watchers found that the cursed area had grown again, now encompassing nearly 2 acres of prairie. But more disturbing still was the discovery of fresh footprints leading away from the clearing, human prints this time, but heading not toward the Wainwright cabin or any other dwelling, but deeper into the wilderness where no civilized person would venture in winter's grip. The sisters, or whatever they had become, were still moving across the prairie, and their midnight activities suggested a purpose far more sinister than simple haunting. Dr. Morrison's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to research the history of the land itself, hoping that knowledge of the area's past might shed light on the present horror. His inquiries led him to elderly Jacob Thornton, the county's unofficial historian and one of the original settlers who had arrived in the territory during the 1820s. Thornton, now past his 70th year, but with memory sharp as winter wind, welcomed the doctor into his cluttered cabin with the eagerness of a man who rarely had visitors interested in his stories. What he revealed about the Wainwright property sent chills through Dr. Morrison's rational mind and connected the current crisis to events that predated white settlement by centuries. According to Thornton, the area where the cursed circle had appeared was known to local Indian tribes as the place where earth bleeds. The Sauk and Meskwaki peoples who had hunted these prairies for generations avoided that particular grove with a reverence born of terror. Tribal elders spoke of ancient times when their ancestors had witnessed strange lights and heard voices speaking in tongues that belonged to no living people. More significantly, Thornton revealed that the Wainwright property had been the site of a previous disappearance. In 1834, just 3 years after his own arrival, a family named Caldwell had established a homestead in the exact location where the sisters' cabin now stood. The Caldwells consisted of a widowed father and his twin daughters, both known for their unusual abilities to predict weather and heal sick animals. Abilities remarkably similar to what the community had observed in the Wainwright sisters. The Caldwell disappearance had followed an almost identical pattern. The daughters vanished during a November night, leaving behind an arranged cabin and no trace of their departure. Search parties had found a circular area in the oak grove where snow would not fall and vegetation had died mysteriously. The expanding circle had eventually encompassed nearly 5 acres before the phenomenon suddenly ceased, leaving behind only blackened earth that remained barren for years. What made Thornton's revelation even more disturbing was his account of what happened to those who investigated the Caldwell disappearance too closely. Several men who had participated in the search began experiencing vivid nightmares, all featuring the same recurring imagery: two young women walking in circles while chanting in an unknown language. Within a year, 3 of these men had died under mysterious circumstances, their bodies found arranged in perfect circles, faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. The pattern was repeating itself, suggesting that whatever force had claimed the Caldwell sisters had remained dormant for 15 years, waiting for the right confluence of circumstances to manifest again. The Wainwright sisters, with their inherited abilities and isolated lifestyle, had somehow awakened something that should have remained buried in the prairie's dark past. Dr. Morrison left Thornton's cabin with the terrible realization that they were not dealing with a random supernatural occurrence, but with something cyclical, purposeful, and far older than the white settlement of Illinois. By the end of the first week, the cursed circle had expanded to encompass nearly 3 acres, and its influence was beginning to affect the surrounding community in ways that defied all attempts at rational explanation. Livestock within a 5-mile radius had begun exhibiting behavior that suggested they could sense something humans could not. Cattle refused to graze facing the direction of the Wainwright property, horses would not be ridden near that section of prairie, and even the hardiest farm dogs cowered at the mere suggestion of traveling toward the cursed ground. More disturbing still were the reports filtering in from families whose properties bordered the affected area. Children throughout the region had begun experiencing identical nightmares. Visions of 2 young women in white dresses walking endlessly in circles while beckoning the dreamers to join them. Parents reported that their children spoke in their sleep, using words that belonged to no known language, yet seemed to carry meaning that bypassed conscious understanding. Mrs. Catherine Hayes, Deputy Hayes's wife, brought the most chilling report to Sheriff Cole. Her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, had begun drawing pictures during her playtime, disturbing images that showed figures emerging from the ground while human shapes walked in circles around them. When questioned about the drawings, Emma claimed that the pretty ladies visited her dreams and taught her the walking song that would help people find their way home. The child's innocence made her revelations even more terrifying. She described the Wainwright sisters in detail, despite never having met them in life, and spoke of other people who had learned the walking song throughout history. According to Emma's dream conversations, many families had lived on that land, and all had eventually joined the circle dance that continued beneath the earth. Dr. Morrison, documenting these reports with the methodical precision of a scientist, began to recognize a pattern that suggested the supernatural influence was growing stronger. The children's nightmares were occurring with increasing frequency, and adults who ventured too close to the cursed ground reported feeling an almost irresistible urge to walk in circles, to follow the same path that the ghostly figures traced each midnight hour. Most alarmingly, the physical symptoms were spreading. Thomas Whitmore, who had discovered the initial disappearance, complained of persistent headaches and a constant sensation of voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. 2 other members of the original search party had developed similar symptoms, and all reported the same recurring dream, standing at the edge of a circular clearing while voices called their names in the darkness. The realization struck the community like a physical blow. Whatever had claimed the Wainwright sisters was not content with its initial victims. The expanding circle of cursed ground was not merely growing in physical size. It was extending its supernatural reach, drawing in anyone who came too close to its malevolent influence. The question was no longer whether they could find the missing sisters, but whether they could prevent others from joining them in whatever terrible fate had claimed their lives. Desperate for answers that might combat the growing supernatural threat, Dr. Morrison sent urgent letters to colleagues in Chicago and Springfield, requesting assistance from anyone with expertise in unusual phenomena. His appeals eventually reached Professor Edmund Hartwell of the University of Illinois, a man whose studies in natural philosophy had touched upon subjects that mainstream academia preferred to ignore. Hartwell arrived in Calhoun County on a bitter December morning, bringing with him instruments that the local residents had never seen, devices for measuring magnetic fields, temperature variations, and what he termed atmospheric disturbances. Despite his scientific training, the professor's first glimpse of the cursed ground left him visibly shaken. No amount of academic preparation had equipped him to witness Earth that generated heat without fire, or the way his compass needle spun wildly when brought within 50 yards of the circle. The measurements Hartwell recorded defied every principle of natural philosophy. The temperature at the center of the cursed area registered consistently at 98 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of air temperature or weather conditions. More puzzling still, the heated ground seemed to pulse in a rhythm that corresponded to no known geological phenomenon, 17 beats per minute, precisely matching the average human respiratory rate, but it was Hartwell's magnetic field readings that had provided the most disturbing data. The instruments detected massive fluctuations in the Earth's natural magnetic properties, creating what the professor described as a vortex of magnetic disturbance that seemed to spiral downward into the ground. These readings suggested that something of enormous size lay buried beneath the cursed circle, something that actively influenced the fundamental forces that governed the physical world. During his third night of observation, Hartwell witnessed the midnight manifestations that the night watchers had reported. Through his scientific instruments, he was able to document electromagnetic disturbances that coincided exactly with the appearance of the ghostly figures. The entities themselves registered as massive disruptions in the magnetic field, their forms creating signatures that suggested they existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Most significantly, Hartwell's equipment detected what he termed resonance patterns emanating from the cursed ground, frequencies that seemed designed to influence human consciousness. These patterns matched the wavelengths associated with the deepest stages of sleep, explaining why the supernatural influence manifested most strongly in dreams and subconscious experiences. The professor's final report, submitted to both Dr. Morrison and the county authorities, contained conclusions that challenged everything 19th-century science understood about the natural world. He theorized that the cursed ground served as some form of dimensional gateway, allowing entities from another realm of existence to interact with the physical world. The Wainwright sisters, he suggested, had somehow become conduits for this otherworldly influence, their disappearance marking not their death but their transformation into something beyond human comprehension. Hartwell's scientific validation of the supernatural threat lent credibility to what many had dismissed as frontier superstition. The cursed ground was real, its influence was expanding, and conventional solutions would be powerless against forces that operated outside the known laws of physics. The supernatural influence claimed its first new victim on December 15th, exactly 4 weeks after the Wainwright sisters' disappearance. Mary Hendricks, a 16-year-old daughter of a farming family whose property lay 2 miles from the cursed ground, began exhibiting behavior that terrified everyone who witnessed it. The transformation began subtly. Mary, normally a cheerful girl known for her skill at the spinning wheel and her lovely singing voice, became withdrawn and distant. She spent hours staring toward the direction of the Wainwright property, her lips moving in silent conversation with unseen companions. When questioned about her behavior, Mary claimed she was learning the steps and practicing the words for something she could not explain. Within days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Mary began walking in circles around her family's cabin, always moving clockwise, always completing exactly 7 circuits before returning to her normal activities. During these walks, she hummed a melody that no one recognized, a haunting tune that seemed to burrow into the listener's mind and echo there long after the sound had ceased. Her parents, John and Rebecca Hendricks, initially attributed their daughter's odd behavior to the stress of the recent supernatural events. But when Mary began speaking in the same unknown language that witnesses had heard from the cursed ground, they realized their daughter was somehow being influenced by the same force that had claimed the Wainwright sisters. The situation reached a crisis on the night of December 20th, when Mary disappeared from her locked bedroom. The family found her standing in the yard, dressed only in her nightgown despite the bitter cold, completing her ritual circles while speaking fluently in the alien tongue. Her eyes were open but unseeing, as if she walked through a dream while her body remained in the waking world. Most disturbing of all were the words Mary spoke when her family managed to break her trance. She delivered messages from Margaret and Eleanor Wainwright, speaking in their voices with perfect accuracy despite having rarely interacted with the sisters during their lives. The messages were invitations, urgings for others to join the eternal dance that continued beneath the prairie, promises of warmth and companionship for those willing to complete the circle. Dr. Morrison, summoned to examine Mary's condition, found her vital signs normal, but detected something that chilled him to the bone. The girl's body temperature was elevated by several degrees, and her skin emanated the same unnatural warmth that characterized the cursed ground. More significantly, when she walked her circular pattern, Mary left footprints that were too deep for her slight weight, as if something invisible walked beside her, adding its mass to her own. The supernatural influence was no longer contained to the original site. It had found a human host, a living conduit through which it could extend its reach into the community. Mary Hendricks was becoming something more and less than human, and her transformation was just beginning. Desperate to save Mary Hendricks before she suffered the same fate as the Wainwright sisters, Sheriff Cole organized an intervention that would test the community's resolve against supernatural forces beyond their understanding. On the night of December 22nd, as winter solstice approached and Mary's trances grew more frequent and intense, 12 of the county's most determined men gathered at the Hendricks farmstead with a plan born of desperation and faith. Reverend Blackwood had spent days studying his predecessor's journal and consulting religious texts that addressed spiritual warfare. He carried with him a vial of water blessed according to ancient rites, a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather, and prayers written in Latin that he hoped might have power over whatever entities had claimed dominion over Mary's soul. The intervention began at 11 o'clock, 1 hour before Mary's nightly ritual typically commenced. The men formed a protective circle around the girl's bedroom, each clutching whatever religious artifact or protective charm they possessed. Dr. Morrison stood ready with medical supplies, though he privately doubted that conventional medicine would prove effective against supernatural affliction. As midnight approached, Mary began her transformation. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and her body temperature spiked so dramatically that steam rose from her skin in the cold December air. When she spoke, it was with voices not her own. First Eleanor Wainwright's gentle tone, then Margaret's more practical manner, and finally something else entirely that made the listening men's blood run cold. The entity speaking through Mary's lips described the cursed ground as the threshold between what is and what waits to be. It spoke of cycles that spanned decades, of families chosen to serve as anchors for forces that existed beyond the veil of mortal perception. The Caldwells, the Wainwrights, and now the Hendricks family all had been selected to facilitate the gradual opening of a gateway that would allow ancient powers to reclaim dominion over the earth. But when Reverend Blackwood began his Latin prayers, something unexpected occurred. Mary's possessing entity recoiled as if struck by physical force, her voice rising to an inhuman shriek that shattered 2 windows and sent the farm animals into panic. The blessed water, when sprinkled on her forehead, caused her skin to smoke and blister, leaving marks that formed patterns too deliberate to be random. The confrontation lasted 3 hours, with Mary's supernatu captors fighting desperately to maintain their hold over her consciousness. The battle was not merely spiritual but physical. Furniture moved without human touch, temperatures fluctuated wildly, and all present witnessed Mary's body levitate several inches above her bed, while voices spoke through her in languages that predated human civilization. When dawn finally broke, Mary collapsed into natural sleep, her fever broken and her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. The intervention had succeeded, but the cost was higher than anyone anticipated. 3 of the men who had participated in the ritual would never be quite the same. Victory over Mary's possession came at a cost that demonstrated the true malevolence of the forces they faced. Within hours of the successful intervention, the 3 men who had shown the strongest reaction to the supernatural battle began exhibiting symptoms that suggested the entity had not been banished, but merely transferred. Samuel Morrison, the supply merchant who had been among the last to see the Wainwright sisters alive, was the first to succumb. By noon on December 23rd, he complained of hearing voices calling his name from the direction of the cursed ground. His wife found him standing in their yard. staring toward the Wainwright property with the same vacant expression that had characterized Mary's trances. Thomas Whitmore, who had discovered the initial disappearance, developed more severe symptoms. He began walking circular patterns around his cabin, 7 circuits that he completed with mechanical precision while humming the same haunting melody that Mary had produced during her possession. When his wife attempted to break his routine, Thomas spoke in Eleanor Wainwright's voice, pleading for understanding and promising that the dance would bring peace to all who joined it. Most disturbing was the fate of Deputy Hayes, whose law enforcement duties had made him intimately familiar with every aspect of the supernatural crisis. Hayes began experiencing what he described as waking dreams in which he found himself standing in the cursed circle, surrounded by figures that included not only the Wainwright sisters but dozens of other people from throughout history, all previous victims of whatever force controlled that accursed ground. In these visions, Hayes learned the terrible truth about the entity's purpose. The cursed circle was not merely a supernatural phenomenon, but a collection point, a gathering place where human souls were prepared for some cosmic purpose that transcended earthly existence. Each family that lived on that particular piece of land was chosen to serve as anchors, their disappearance marking another step toward the completion of a ritual that had been centuries in the making. Dr. Morrison, documenting these developments with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire involvement in the crisis, began to understand that they faced something far more organized and purposeful than random supernatural activity. The entity's influence was not chaotic but carefully planned, selecting specific individuals whose disappearance would contribute to a greater design that human minds could barely comprehend. The attempted rescue of Mary Hendricks had succeeded only in redirecting the supernatural force toward new victims. Rather than defeating the entity, they had simply provided it with fresh opportunities to expand its influence throughout the community. The cursed ground continued to grow, now encompassing nearly 5 acres, and the midnight manifestations were becoming more frequent and more powerful. Winter was deepening, and with it came the realization that they were not fighting for the recovery of missing persons, but for the very soul of their community. The entity was patient, methodical, and absolutely determined to complete whatever terrible purpose had won it to their corner of Illinois. Professor Hartwell's departure from Calhoun County had been abrupt and unexplained, but his final contribution to understanding the supernatural crisis arrived by express mail on January 3, 1850. The package contained a manuscript that would fundamentally alter the community's comprehension of what they faced, transforming their perception of random supernatural occurrence into recognition of their role in an ancient cosmic pattern. The document, written in multiple languages including Latin, Ancient Greek, and symbols that predated known writing systems, had been discovered in the private collection of a deceased scholar in Boston. Hartwell's translation, accompanied by detailed notes and diagrams, revealed that similar phenomena had been documented throughout history, occurring in locations scattered across the globe, but following identical patterns of manifestation. According to the manuscript, the cursed grounds were anchor points in a vast supernatural network, places where the barrier between dimensions was naturally thin. Every few decades, when astronomical conditions aligned properly, entities from what the text called the realm of eternal dance would select families with hereditary sensitivity to supernatural forces. These chosen families served as living keys, their willing or unwilling participation in specific rituals, allowing the entities to establish permanent footholds in the physical world. The manuscript described 13 such anchor points in North America alone, each associated with cyclical disappearances that followed the same pattern observed in Calhoun County. Families would arrive, seemingly by chance, to establish homesteads on these cursed locations. Within a generation, daughters born with the sight would begin experiencing supernatural contact. Their eventual disappearance, always during winter months when the veil between worlds was thinnest, would activate the anchor point and expand its zone of influence. Most disturbing was the manuscript's revelation about the ultimate purpose of these anchor points. When all 13 locations were simultaneously active, they would form a geometric pattern across the continent that would allow the entities to permanently merge their realm with Earth's reality. Humanity would not be destroyed but transformed, incorporated into an eternal dance that transcended physical death but eliminated individual will and consciousness. The text indicated that 12 of the 13 anchor points had already been activated throughout North America's colonial history. The Wainwright property in Calhoun County was destined to be the final piece of this supernatural puzzle, its activation completing a pattern that had been centuries in the making. Hartwell's notes included astronomical calculations showing that the optimal alignment would occur during the winter solstice of 1850, less than 12 months away. If the entity succeeded in fully activating the Illinois anchor point before that date, the transformation of reality itself would become irreversible. The community now understood that they were not simply dealing with local hauntings or isolated disappearances. They stood at the epicenter of a cosmic conspiracy that threatened not just their own survival but the fundamental nature of human existence across the entire continent. Time was running out, and conventional resistance had proven worse than useless against forces that operated according to laws that transcended earthly physics. Armed with the terrifying knowledge contained in Hartwell's manuscript, Sheriff Cole made the difficult decision to evacuate the families most directly threatened by the supernatural influence. If they could not defeat the entity, perhaps they could deny it the human anchors necessary to complete its cosmic ritual. The plan seemed logical, born of desperation, but grounded in the hope that physical distance might break the supernatural bonds that tied specific families to the cursed ground. The evacuation began on January the 15th, 1850, with the families whose children had experienced the most severe supernatural symptoms. The Hendricks family, despite Mary's apparent recovery from possession, were among the first to load their belongings onto wagons and attempt departure for relatives in Ohio. Thomas Whitmore and his wife prepared to abandon their homestead and seek sanctuary with family members in Indiana. Even Deputy Hayes requested reassignment to a county far from the supernatural influence that was slowly consuming his sanity. But the entity that controlled the cursed ground was not so easily denied its chosen servants. The Hendricks family made it less than 10 miles from their property before their wagon wheels became mired in mud that hadn't existed moments before. Every attempt to free the vehicle only drove it deeper into earth that seemed to actively resist their escape. Mary, who had remained quiet during the journey's beginning, began humming her haunting melody and walking in circles around the trapped wagon. When her parents attempted to restrain her, she spoke in Eleanor Wainwright's voice, explaining that the dance must be completed and that chosen families cannot leave the sacred ground. Thomas Whitmore experienced an even more dramatic intervention. His wagon had traveled nearly 15 miles when the horses suddenly stopped, trembling with terror and refusing all attempts at encouragement. The air around them began to shimmer with unnatural heat, and footprints appeared in the snow, the same inhuman tracks that had been found at the cursed circle. The footprints formed a path leading directly back toward the Wainwright property, and Thomas found himself compelled to follow despite his conscious desire to continue fleeing. Deputy Hayes never managed to depart at all. On the morning scheduled for his departure, he was found standing in his yard, staring toward the cursed ground with the vacant expression that had become so familiar. When addressed, he responded in Margaret Wainwright's voice, stating that officers of the law must remain to witness the completion of justice. By evening, all 3 families had returned to their properties, their belongings mysteriously unpacked and arranged exactly as they had been before the evacuation attempt. The supernatural force would not be denied its chosen anchors, and physical distance provided no protection from bonds that transcended earthly limitations. The community was trapped, held captive by forces that operated according to laws that made escape impossible. The entity was ensuring that all necessary components for its ritual would remain in place until the cosmic alignment that would complete its centuries-long plan. As January progressed into February, the supernatural influence over Calhoun County intensified in ways that challenged the sanity of everyone who remained in the affected area. The failed evacuation had convinced the entity that more direct methods were necessary to ensure the compliance of its chosen servants, and what followed was a systematic assault on the psychological stability of the entire community. Children throughout the region began disappearing from their beds during the night, only to be found at dawn standing in perfect circles in various locations around the county. They would be discovered holding hands, moving in slow, clockwise rotations, while chanting in the alien language that had become so terrifyingly familiar. When awakened from these trances, the children retained no memory of leaving their homes or gathering with others, but they all carried the same message. The pretty ladies say it's almost time for everyone to dance. Adults fared no better under the escalating supernatural pressure. Farmers found themselves walking their property in circular patterns that matched the ritual movements observed at the cursed ground. Shopkeepers get their goods in spiraling designs that served no practical purpose but felt compulsively necessary. Even the county's most rational citizens began experiencing shared dreams that featured identical imagery, endless processions of people walking in circles while voices promised eternal peace for those who joined the sacred dance. The physical manifestations grew more dramatic as well. The cursed ground now encompassed nearly 8 acres, its supernatural heat creating a microclimate that kept the area free of snow even during the worst blizzards. More disturbing still, objects and buildings throughout the county began showing signs of the same mysterious influence. Wooden structures developed spiral grain patterns that hadn't existed during their construction. Metal tools became uncomfortably warm to the touch. Even food stored in root cellars began spoiling in circular patterns that spread outward from central points. Dr. Morrison, struggling to maintain his scientific objectivity in the face of escalating irrationality, documented over 30 cases of what he termed sympathetic possession, residents whose behavior indicated supernatural influence despite having no direct contact with the cursed ground. These individuals exhibited elevated body temperatures, spoke occasionally in the alien language, and demonstrated knowledge of events they could not possibly have witnessed. Most alarming was the discovery that the supernatural influence was no longer confined to nighttime hours. People began experiencing daytime trances, finding themselves drawn to walk in circles regardless of their location or activity. Farmers abandoned their work in mid-task to complete 7 circuits around their barns. Housewives left bread burning in ovens to trace spiral patterns in the snow outside their homes. The entity's control was becoming total, its influence permeating every aspect of daily life in Calhoun County. The community was being systematically prepared for some grand culmination that would occur when winter reached its deepest point and the veil between dimensions grew thin enough to accommodate the final phase of the ancient ritual. Resistance was becoming not just futile but impossible, as human will itself was being subsumed into the cosmic dance that had claimed the Wainwright sisters. On February 28, 1850, as winter reached its most brutal intensity, the entity finally revealed the true scope of its purpose through a mass possession event that affected nearly every resident of Calhoun County simultaneously. At precisely midnight, hundreds of people throughout the region rose from their beds and began walking toward the Wainwright property, their movements coordinated with supernatural precision. They came from farms scattered across 20 square miles, men and women and children moving through the bitter cold without adequate clothing, yet showing no signs of discomfort from temperatures that should have been fatal. Each person walked with the same measured gait, their eyes reflecting the blue-white luminescence that emanated from the cursed ground. They moved in converging columns that formed geometric patterns visible from elevated positions, creating a living mandala that spiraled inward toward the supernatural epicenter. Dr. Morrison, among the few who retained enough conscious will to observe rather than participate, witnessed the gathering from his hiding place in a grove of trees near the cursed circle. What he saw there challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of the supernatural force they faced. The cursed ground had become a vast amphitheater of unnatural light, its heated earth glowing with an intensity that turned night into twilight. At the center of the 8-acre circle stood figures that Morrison recognized as the Wainwright sisters but transformed beyond human recognition. Margaret and Eleanor had become something ethereal yet substantial, their forms shifting between solid flesh and translucent energy. They were no longer victims but willing participants, their faces radiant with an expression of cosmic understanding that transcended earthly emotion. Surrounding the sisters were dozens of other figures, the accumulated victims from centuries of supernatural gatherings at anchor points across North America. The Caldwell sisters from 1834 were there, along with families from even earlier periods, all transformed into beings that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. They were not dead in any conventional sense, but had been elevated to serve as intermediaries between the human realm and whatever cosmic intelligence orchestrated these gatherings. As the possessed residents of Calhoun County arranged themselves in concentric circles around the cursed ground, the transformed beings began speaking in unison. Their words, delivered in voices that harmonized across impossible octaves, explained that humanity was being prepared for transcendence. The physical world was merely a temporary stage in consciousness evolution, and the anchor points were designed to facilitate the next phase of existence. Death, they explained, was an illusion created by limited perception. The dance was actually a process of consciousness expansion that would eventually encompass all of humanity, transforming the species into something capable of existing across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The individual personalities would be preserved but integrated into a collective awareness that could perceive cosmic truth directly. The revelation was both terrifying and seductive, offering immortality and infinite knowledge at the cost of independent will and earthly attachments. The residents of Calhoun County were being invited to become pioneers in humanity's next evolutionary leap. As dawn approached on March the 1st, the mass possession gradually released its hold on the residents of Calhoun County, leaving them standing in the frozen fields around the cursed ground with full memory of what they had witnessed and heard. The supernatural entities had delivered their message and extended their invitation, but they had also granted humanity the dignity of conscious choice in humanity's ultimate destiny. The revelation created a schism in the community that cut deeper than any previous disagreement. Families found themselves divided between those who viewed the entity's offer as a miraculous opportunity for transcendence and those who saw it as damnation disguised as salvation. The debate that followed would determine not only the fate of Calhoun County, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. Reverend Blackwood led the resistance faction, arguing that the supernatural offer represented temptation on a cosmic scale. Standing before his congregation in the little wooden church that had become a sanctuary for those who chose to remain fully human, he delivered sermons that framed the choice in theological terms. The entities, he claimed, were not benevolent guides but fallen angels seeking to corrupt humanity's relationship with divine providence. True transcendence could only be achieved through faith, not through surrender to forces that operated outside God's natural order. But his congregation was no longer unified in faith. Nearly half of the township's residents had come to view the supernatural manifestations as evidence of humanity's readiness for the next stage of spiritual evolution. Led by Thomas Whitmore, whose experience with the entities had convinced him of their benevolent intentions, this faction argued that rejection of the offer represented fear-based thinking that would condemn humanity to remain trapped in physical limitations forever. The philosophical divide manifested in practical ways that threatened the community's survival. Families whose members held opposing views found themselves unable to cooperate in the basic tasks of frontier life. Farmers who believed in transcendence refused to plant crops that would not be needed after the transformation. Those who rejected the entity's offer hoarded supplies and prepared for extended conflict. Children found themselves caught between parents who could no longer agree on the fundamental nature of reality itself. Dr. Morrison, struggling to maintain scientific objectivity in a situation that had transcended rational analysis, attempted to document both perspectives with equal care. His journals from this period reveal a man grappling with questions that challenged the foundations of empirical knowledge. How could science evaluate claims about dimensional transcendence? What instruments could measure the relative value of individual consciousness versus collective awareness? How could human judgment assess the motivations of entities that operated according to cosmic rather than earthly principles? The community had until winter solstice of 1850 to reach a decision that would affect not only their own fate, but their role in a transformation that could reshape human existence across the entire continent. The choice between transcendence and resistance would define the ultimate legacy of the Wainwright sisters' mysterious disappearance. As spring arrived in Calhoun County, the philosophical divide over the supernatural entities offer manifested in ways that transformed daily life into a constant reminder of the cosmic choice that loomed ahead. The community had effectively split into two distinct populations occupying the same physical space, their conflicting worldviews creating tensions that threatened to erupt into violence. The Transcendents, as they came to be known, established their own informal governance structure led by Thomas Whitmore and several other men who had experienced direct supernatural contact. They ceased maintaining their farms in traditional ways, instead arranging their crops in the spiral patterns that had become associated with the entity's influence. Their livestock were allowed to roam freely, as the Transcendents claimed that concepts of ownership and property boundaries were illusions that would be irrelevant after the consciousness transformation. More disturbing to the resistors was the Transcendents' treatment of their children. Parents who believed in the entity's promise began teaching their sons and daughters the alien language that had been heard from the cursed ground, claiming that fluency in this cosmic tongue would ease the transition to higher consciousness. Children in transcendent families spent hours each day walking in ritual circles, practicing the movements that would supposedly prepare them for dimensional transcendence. The resistors, led by Reverend Blackwood and Sheriff Cole, responded by establishing their own community infrastructure that operated independently of transcendent cooperation. They organized armed patrols to monitor the cursed ground and prevent transcendent families from conducting large gatherings that might accidentally trigger premature activation of the supernatural portal. They also established a school system designed to counteract what they viewed as the supernatural indoctrination of local children. Dr. Morrison found himself caught between the two factions, his scientific training making him sympathetic to empirical investigation, while his human instincts recoiled from the implications of consciousness absorption into a collective entity. His attempts to maintain neutrality became increasingly difficult as both sides demanded his endorsement of their perspective on the supernatural phenomena. The schism reached a critical point in May when Mary Hendricks, whose successful resistance to possession had made her a symbol for both factions, announced her intention to join the Transcendents. Her decision, made after chaos of private contemplation, sent shockwaves through the resistor community and emboldened the Transcendents to become more aggressive in their recruitment efforts. Mary's explanation for her choice revealed the sophisticated nature of the entity's psychological influence. She claimed that her brief possession had shown her glimpses of the expanded consciousness that awaited humanity, describing experiences of existing simultaneously across multiple dimensions and perceiving cosmic truths that were impossible to convey in human language. The memory of that transcendent state had made ordinary human existence feel limited and ultimately meaningless. Her defection demonstrated that the supernatural entities were not relying solely on fear or coercion to achieve their goals. They were offering genuine experiences of expanded consciousness that proved seductive to individuals seeking meaning beyond the harsh realities of frontier life. Throughout the summer months of 1850, both natural and supernatural phenomena intensified around Calhoun County, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension as the prophesied winter solstice approached. The cursed ground had expanded to encompass nearly 12 acres, its supernatural heat creating a permanent microclimate that supported vegetation unknown to the Illinois prairie. Strange flowers bloomed in spiral patterns, their colors shifting through spectrums that human eyes struggled to process, while grass grew in geometric designs that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The transcendent community interpreted these developments as confirmation that the cosmic transformation was proceeding according to divine plan. They established a permanent encampment at the edge of the cursed ground, with families taking turns maintaining vigils that lasted from sunset to dawn. During these watches, they reported increasingly frequent communication with the transformed Wainwright sisters and other entities that had achieved dimensional transcendence. According to transcendent accounts, the supernatural beings were using the summer months to prepare the anchor point for its final activation. The expanded consciousness of the transformed entities allowed them to perceive cosmic alignments and dimensional fluctuations that would reach optimal conditions during the December solstice. They claimed that the portal between realms was already partially open, requiring only the willing participation of enough human consciousnesses to complete the process. The resistors, meanwhile, documented their own disturbing observations of the changing supernatural landscape. Sheriff Cole's patrols reported that the cursed ground was now visible from distances of more than 20 miles, its unnatural glow creating a pillar of light that rose high into the atmosphere. More alarmingly, the zone of supernatural influence was expanding beyond the heated earth itself. Animals throughout the county exhibited behavioral changes that suggested sensitivity to forces that humans could only partially perceive. Dr. Morrison's scientific instruments continued to register electromagnetic anomalies that intensified with each passing week. His measurements indicated that the portal between dimensions was indeed strengthening, creating distortions in the fundamental forces that governed physical reality. Temperature fluctuations, gravitational variations, and magnetic field disruptions were spreading outward from the cursed ground in patterns that corresponded to the geometric designs observed in the supernatural vegetation. Most significantly, both factions began reporting identical astronomical phenomena that seemed to validate the entity's claims about cosmic alignment. The constellation patterns visible from Calhoun County were shifting in ways that contradicted established astronomical knowledge, while the phases of the moon appeared to be accelerating toward a configuration that would occur precisely at winter solstice. These signs convinced even some resistors that the supernatural entities possessed genuine cosmic knowledge and power. The evidence suggested that whether humanity chose transcendence or resistance, the dimensional portal would indeed open during the December solstice. The only question remaining was whether Calhoun County would serve as humanity's gateway to expanded consciousness, or as the battleground where the species made its final stand for individual free will. The summer was ending, and with autumn would come the final preparations for a choice that would echo across eternity. As October arrived with its characteristic prairie winds and the first hints of winter's approach, both factions in Calhoun County began their final preparations for the cosmic event that would determine humanity's future. The supernatural entities, through their communications with the transcendent community, had specified that the dimensional portal would fully activate during the moment of winter solstice, December 21st at precisely midnight, when astronomical conditions would align to thin the barriers between realms to their absolute minimum. The Transcendents organized what they called the Great Gathering, a systematic process of preparing every willing consciousness for the moment of transcendence. Families from surrounding counties, drawn by reports of the supernatural phenomena, began arriving in Calhoun County to participate in the cosmic transformation. The movement had grown beyond its local origins to encompass several hundred people who viewed the dimensional portal as humanity's greatest opportunity for spiritual evolution. Led by Thomas Whitmore and Mary Hendricks, the Transcendents established elaborate camps around the cursed ground, with each family group occupying positions that formed part of a vast geometric pattern. They spent their days practicing the ritual movements and alien chants that the supernatural entities claimed were necessary for successful consciousness transfer. Children born into transcendent families had become remarkably fluent in the cosmic language, their young minds adapting to concepts that challenged adult comprehension. The resistors, meanwhile, prepared for what Reverend Blackwood termed the final battle for human souls. They had received support from religious communities throughout Illinois, with ministers and devoted laypeople arriving to join what they viewed as a spiritual war against demonic forces disguised as benevolent guides. Sheriff Cole coordinated with state authorities, though official support was limited due to skepticism about the supernatural claims. Dr. Morrison, still attempting to maintain scientific objectivity, had established a network of observation points around the cursed ground, equipped with instruments that could document whatever occurred during the solstice activation. His measurements throughout the autumn months showed that the electromagnetic anomalies were increasing exponentially, suggesting that the approaching cosmic event would indeed produce phenomena that transcended normal physical laws. The most disturbing development was the behavior of the transformed entities themselves. The Wainwright sisters and other supernatural beings became increasingly visible during daylight hours, their forms shifting between human appearance and something altogether more alien. They moved through both transcendent and resistor communities with apparent freedom, immune to physical barriers and seemingly able to influence human consciousness through proximity alone. As November progressed toward December, even the most skeptical observers could no longer deny that Calhoun County was approaching a crisis that would challenge humanity's understanding of existence itself. The supernatural entities had spent nearly a year preparing the dimensional portal, and their patience was nearing its end. The winter solstice was only weeks away, and with it would come the culmination of a cosmic plan that had been centuries in the making. The choice between transcendence and resistance could no longer be delayed, and the consequences would reshape the fundamental nature of human consciousness forever. On December 15th, just 6 days before the prophesied solstice activation, the supernatural entities made their final revelation about the true nature of the cosmic transformation they had orchestrated. The disclosure came simultaneously to both transcendents and resistors, delivered through a mass psychic communication that reached every consciousness within 50 miles of the cursed ground. The entities revealed that the anchor points throughout North America were not randomly located, but had been established at sites where previous civilizations had achieved dimensional transcendence. The Illinois location had been sacred to indigenous peoples for millennia, precisely because it served as a natural gateway between realms of existence. European settlement had temporarily disrupted the cosmic patterns, but the arrival of families with hereditary psychic sensitivity, the Caldwells, the Wainwrights, and others, had restored the supernatural balance necessary for portal activation. More disturbing still was the revelation that the choice between transcendence and resistance was ultimately illusory. The dimensional portal would open regardless of human cooperation, activated by cosmic forces that operated independently of individual will. However, the nature of humanity's experience during the transformation would depend entirely on their level of preparation and acceptance. Those who embraced transcendence would retain their individual personalities while gaining access to expanded consciousness and multidimensional existence. Those who resisted would experience the transformation as dissolution, their consciousness scattered across dimensions without the coherent structure necessary for continued identity. The entities explained that similar transformations had occurred throughout cosmic history as various species reached the evolutionary threshold necessary for dimensional transcendence. Resistance to the process invariably resulted in species extinction, not through active destruction but through the inability to maintain coherent existence across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Cooperation with the transformation, however, opened unlimited possibilities for consciousness expansion and cosmic exploration. Dr. Morrison, documenting this final revelation with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire involvement in the crisis, realized that the community faced a choice between adaptation and annihilation. The supernatural entities were not offering transcendence as one option among many. They were describing it as the inevitable result of cosmic evolution, with cooperation determining only whether the experience would be positive or traumatic. The psychological impact of this revelation shattered the remaining cohesion of the resistor movement. Faced with the certainty that the transformation would occur regardless of their opposition, many families abandoned their resistance and joined the transcendent camps around the cursed ground. Others, led by Reverend Blackwood, chose to face potential annihilation rather than surrender their human identity to cosmic forces they neither trusted nor understood. As December 21st approached, Calhoun County prepared for an event that would either elevate humanity to a higher plane of existence or witness the end of human consciousness as it had existed for millennia. The supernatural entities had revealed their ultimate purpose, and humanity's response would determine whether the species had a future in the transformed reality that was about to emerge. The final choice could no longer be delayed, and the consequences would be eternal. December 20th, 1850, arrived with an otherworldly stillness that seemed to hold the very atmosphere in suspended animation. The cursed ground now encompassed nearly 15 acres, its supernatural radiance visible from distances of more than 50 miles, drawing pilgrims and curiosity seekers from across the Midwest. The approaching solstice had intensified the electromagnetic anomalies to levels that Dr. Morrison's instruments could barely register, suggesting that the dimensional barrier was already beginning its final dissolution. The transcendent community had swollen to over 800 souls, with entire families arriving daily to participate in what they believed would be humanity's greatest evolutionary leap. They had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the cursed ground, their camps forming a vast mandala pattern that could be seen from elevated positions throughout the county. Children moved freely between family groups, their mastery of the alien language allowing them to communicate directly with the supernatural entities that now appeared openly during daylight hours. The remaining resistors, numbering fewer than 200, had fortified themselves in the wooden church that had become their final sanctuary. Reverend Blackwood led continuous prayer services, his congregation joining in hymns and biblical recitations intended to maintain their spiritual connection to traditional human existence. They had accepted that they could not prevent the dimensional portal's activation, but they remained determined to face whatever came next with their individual consciousness intact. Sheriff Cole and his deputies maintained order through sheer force of will, their authority recognized by both factions, despite the supernatural chaos surrounding them. Cole's final report, to state authorities, written on December 20th, provided an official record of events that would challenge government understanding of reality itself. He requested that military support be made available, though he privately doubted that conventional weapons would prove effective against entities that existed across multiple dimensional planes. Dr. Morrison completed his scientific preparations with instruments positioned to record whatever occurred during the solstice activation. His final journal entry, composed on the eve of the cosmic event, reflected a man who had witnessed phenomena that challenged every assumption of 19th-century science. He expressed hope that his documentation would survive whatever transformation awaited humanity, providing future generations with empirical evidence of consciousness evolution. The supernatural entities themselves had become increasingly active as the solstice approached, their forms stabilizing into appearances that combined human features with geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. They moved through both communities freely, their presence no longer causing the panic that had characterized earlier encounters. Instead, they emanated a sense of cosmic patience, as if they were shepherds guiding their flock toward an inevitable destiny. As midnight of December 21st drew near, Calhoun County prepared for an event that would either fulfill humanity's cosmic potential or witness the end of individual consciousness as the species had known it for millennia. The choice had been made, the preparations completed, and eternity waited just hours away. At 11:47 p.m. on December 21st, 1850, 13 minutes before the moment of cosmic alignment, the dimensional portal began its final activation sequence. The cursed ground erupted with luminescence that transformed night into something beyond day, a radiance that seemed to emanate from another realm of existence entirely. The electromagnetic instruments that Dr. Morrison had positioned around the supernatural site registered readings that exceeded their maximum calibrations before failing entirely, their metal components liquefying under forces that operated outside known physics. The transformation began with the willing participants, the 800 transcendents who had arranged themselves in geometric patterns around the cursed ground began rising into the air, their physical forms becoming translucent as their consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of 3-dimensional existence. They retained their human appearance while simultaneously manifesting additional aspects that existed in dimensions human eyes could not fully process. Their faces radiated joy and cosmic understanding as they achieved the transcendent state that the supernatural entities had promised. The Wainwright sisters, transformed now beyond any resemblance to their original human forms, appeared at the center of the dimensional portal as guides for the ascending consciousness. Margaret and Eleanor had become beings of pure energy and intention, their individual personalities preserved but elevated to serve as intermediaries between human understanding and cosmic truth. They called to their ascending community in voices that harmonized across impossible octaves, welcoming each consciousness into the expanded awareness that awaited beyond physical limitations. The resistors in their church sanctuary experienced the transformation differently. As the dimensional portal achieved full activation, Those who had chosen to maintain their purely human consciousness found themselves caught in a cosmic storm that challenged their ability to exist coherently across multiple planes. Reverend Blackwood led his congregation in final prayers as their individual identities began to fragment under the pressure of dimensional forces they had chosen not to embrace. But in those final moments, as the portal prepared to close and establish the new reality that would govern human existence, something unexpected occurred. A small group of resistors, led by young Emma Hayes, the child who had first dreamed of the pretty ladies, made a discovery that changed the nature of the transformation entirely. Emma had realized that the choice between transcendence and resistance was false. The supernatural entities had offered only two options, but human consciousness possessed a third possibility that the cosmic beings had not anticipated. Rather than choosing between individual identity and collective transcendence, humanity could choose synthesis, maintaining personal consciousness while gaining access to expanded awareness. As the portal reached its moment of maximum activation, Emma and her group of children stepped forward into the dimensional gateway, their young minds capable of achieving the synthesis that adult consciousness had been unable to imagine. The transformation was complete, but its ultimate outcome remained to be determined by humanity's capacity for evolution beyond the limitations that even cosmic entities had assumed were absolute. When dawn broke on December 22, 1850, Calhoun County existed in a reality that transcended everything humanity had previously understood about the nature of existence. The dimensional portal had permanently altered the fundamental structure of space and time in the region, creating a zone where multiple planes of reality coexisted simultaneously. The 800 transcendents had achieved their desired transformation. Their consciousness expanded to encompass cosmic awareness while retaining their individual personalities. They existed as beings of living energy who could manifest physical form when necessary, but were no longer limited by the constraints of three-dimensional reality. They had become humanity's first ambassadors to the cosmic intelligence that governed multidimensional existence. The resistors who had refused transformation found that their choice had been honored, but at a cost that few had anticipated. They remained fully human, trapped in three-dimensional existence while surrounded by a reality that operated according to expanded physical laws. Their church had become an island of traditional reality within a sea of transformed space, requiring constant spiritual effort to maintain their purely human state. But it was Emma Hayes and her group of children who had achieved something unprecedented in cosmic history. Their synthesis of individual consciousness and collective awareness had created a new form of existence that even the supernatural entities had not foreseen. These children existed simultaneously as humans and as transcended beings, capable of moving freely between dimensional planes while maintaining perfect coherence of individual identity. Dr. Morrison's instruments, those that had survived the transformation, registered readings that indicated Calhoun County now existed partially outside normal space-time. The region had become a permanent anchor point where beings from multiple dimensions could interact, learn from each other, and explore possibilities that neither purely human nor purely transcended consciousness could achieve alone. The Wainwright sisters, in their roles as dimensional guides, established communication protocols that allowed all three groups, transcendents, resistors, and the synthesized children, to coexist peacefully in the transformed reality. Their farm had become a meeting ground where different forms of consciousness could share knowledge and experience without losing their essential nature. As news of the Calhoun County transformation spread beyond Illinois, humanity faced questions that would reshape civilization itself. The dimensional portal remained active, offering consciousness evolution to anyone willing to make the journey to what had become known as the sacred ground. But the children's discovery of synthesis had shown that transcendence and individuality need not be mutually exclusive. The mysterious disappearance of the Wainwright sisters had led not to tragedy, but to humanity's greatest evolutionary opportunity. Science could not deny what had occurred in that Illinois prairie, and the implications would echo through human development for centuries to come. The cosmic dance had begun, but humanity had learned to choreograph its own steps within the eternal pattern of existence itself. Would you like me to explore your theory about what really happened to the Wainwright sisters? Tell me in the comments below. Do you believe this was destiny unfolding or something far more sinister manipulating human consciousness for its own cosmic purposes?